In the late 16th century, France was a fractured land. The wars of religion between Catholics and Huguenots had torn through the countryside for decades, leaving behind a trail of devastation. Rural regions like Franche-Comté, then part of the Free County of Burgundy under Habsburg rule, were especially vulnerable. In these areas, central authority was weak, famine and disease were common, and popular justice often filled the vacuum left by overburdened or absent courts. This combination of instability and fear created fertile ground for superstition, particularly the belief in witches and werewolves. The village of Saint-Bonneau, near the town of Dole, lay nestled among dense woodlands. These forests, once a source of sustenance, had become places of dread. Reports of children disappearing had increased throughout the autumn of 1572. Some were found dead, partially eaten with limbs missing. Others simply vanished. In a society that lacked modern forensic understanding, such deaths could not easily be explained by animals or outlaws. Instead, people turned to the supernatural. In Franche-Comté, belief in werewolves or loups-garous was common and taken seriously by legal authorities. The church taught that the devil could bestow upon his followers the ability to transform into wolves. These were not the wolves of folklore alone, but men corrupted by witchcraft who fed on human flesh in service to Satan. These teachings were reinforced through sermons, pamphlets, and public trials. In this atmosphere, a half-glimpsed figure in the woods, a pile of bloody rags, or the hushed whisper of a frightened child could ignite widespread panic. The region's judicial records show an uptick in accusations involving supernatural crimes during this period. Authorities conducted inquisitions not merely into murder, but into demonic activity. Confessions extracted under torture often confirmed the worst fears of both church and state. While modern readers might dismiss these episodes as hysteria for villagers in Dole and its surroundings, the threat was real and imminent. It was in this tense context that whispers began to coalesce around a name, Gilles Garnier. A reclusive man who lived on the outskirts of Saint-Bonneau-Garnier had long been viewed with suspicion. His decision to reside in a crumbling hermitage outside the village limits placed him in a liminal position, neither fully part of the community nor completely outside it. In pre-modern Europe, the social fabric of village life was tightly knit, and those who lived apart were often seen as suspect. Economic hardship had pushed many like Garnier to the edges of society. He was reportedly thin, unkempt, and taciturn, sometimes seen foraging for roots or wood near the forest. Villagers claimed that he muttered to himself and avoided markets unless absolutely necessary. While none of this constituted proof of wrongdoing, it painted a portrait that aligned all too well with existing fears. When a man like Garnier emerged as a possible suspect in the string of gruesome child deaths, few were inclined to question the accusation deeply. However, before Garnier would be named directly, the killings had to escalate. The initial cases were treated as isolated tragedies, perhaps the work of wolves or bandits. But as the bodies accumulated, and as their mutilation became more specific, arms torn from sockets, thigh flesh stripped from bone, faces left unrecognizable, the villagers' anxiety grew. Children were no longer allowed to walk alone, and even adults began avoiding the woods at dusk. The authorities in Dole took notice. They commissioned local patrols and sent messengers to surrounding areas to track similar incidents. What they discovered was deeply unsettling attacks had been occurring at regular intervals, sometimes just days apart. The victims were always children or adolescents. They were taken from paths, farmyards, or while gathering wood, never from within homes or heavily populated areas. The pattern suggested intelligence. The killer was watching, waiting, and choosing vulnerable targets. Fears of a werewolf gained traction, not merely through rumor, but through legal precedent. Just a few years prior, other werewolf trials had taken place in nearby regions. In 1521, the infamous case of the werewolves of Poligny had resulted in several executions. These cases were widely known and cited in court proceedings. The theological framework for understanding such events had been well established. Sin led to deviance. Deviance opened the door to demonic influence, and demonic influence could manifest in physical transformation. Authorities believed that they were not merely investigating murder, they were engaged in spiritual warfare. These notions were not confined to the uneducated. Learned judges, clerics, and even physicians often subscribed to theories of demonic possession and metamorphosis. The Malleus Maleficarum, published a century earlier, remained a widely referenced text. It argued forcefully that witches and werewolves were not only real, but capable of harming others through both natural and supernatural means. Trials across Europe routinely accepted confessions of shape-shifting, especially when reinforced by torture or community consensus. With this backdrop, any deviation from social norms, especially among the impoverished, the isolated, or the mentally unstable, could quickly become the basis for a criminal investigation. Garnier, with his solitary lifestyle, poor appearance, and surly manner, fit the archetype too perfectly. Though he had not yet been accused directly, his position on the social periphery ensured that it was only a matter of time before suspicion found him. The village of Saint-Bonneau was not alone in its fear. Throughout France, tales of loups-garous circulated in taverns, churches, and households. These stories often blurred the lines between crime reporting and folklore. They served not only to frighten, but also to instruct stay close to home, obey your parents, attend mass. The threat of the werewolf was a cultural tool as much as a perceived reality, a means of enforcing conformity in a chaotic age. As the end of 1572 approached, the climate of fear in Franche-Comté reached a boiling point. A particularly gruesome attack on a young girl whose remains were found in a shallow woodland grave ignited renewed outrage. This time, however, there was a witness. A group of men claimed to have seen a pale, ragged figure crouching over the corpse. They pursued him, though he vanished into the trees. One of them, a shepherd, insisted he recognized the figure's gait. It was Gilles Garnier. The fragile line between suspicion and accusation had now been crossed. Garnier would soon be hunted, not merely as a criminal, but as a monster. Gilles Garnier had not always been a hermit. Born sometime in the early 1500s, historians disagree on the exact date he likely grew up in modest conditions, possibly within the very region where he would later commit his crimes. Little documentation survives about his youth, but it is clear that Garnier once lived among people. He eventually married a woman named Apolline, a decision that perhaps came late in life, and soon after the couple moved into a dilapidated structure on the edge of the forest near Saint-Bonneau. From that point on, Garnier lived apart from the rest of the village, surviving on whatever he could find. In the woods, herbs, roots, small animals, and firewood. His decision to live in such isolation was unusual, even dangerous in 16th century rural France. Community ties were essential to survival, both for economic support and legal protection. By choosing seclusion, Garnier essentially removed himself from the safety net of village life. It was a choice that made sense only in extreme hardship, or with a deep distrust of others. This social withdrawal appears to have coincided with increasing mental instability. Witnesses later described Garnier as strange, a man given to fits of muttering and long silences. His neighbors viewed him with suspicion even before the killings began. When he did visit the village, he often seemed disoriented or agitated. Though he was not openly hostile, his presence evoked discomfort. His appearance, gaunt with matted hair and tattered clothes, further amplified the impression that something was not right. Apolline's presence in this narrative is telling. Accounts vary as to whether she encouraged her husband to provide more food or simply shared in his desperation. What is known is that both lived in conditions of extreme poverty. Hunger was a persistent theme in their lives. This period in France saw recurring crop failures and food shortages, particularly in rural regions where infrastructure was weak. The poor, already marginalized, faced starvation. One plausible theory mentioned in Garnier's own confession was that he initially attempted to hunt game but failed to secure enough to sustain himself and his wife. Wild animals were scarce, and competition from other foragers was intense. Garnier's frustration and desperation escalated. According to his later statements during trial, it was in this state of despair that a dark transformation began. Here the narrative veers into the supernatural, as Garnier claimed to have encountered a spectral figure in the woods, a black man who offered him an ointment that would allow him to transform into a wolf. The offer, according to Garnier, was conditional. In return for this power, he must feed on human flesh. Such a confession fits squarely within the theological framework of the time. The black man was a well-known euphemism for the devil. The ointment, a staple of witchcraft accusations, was said to contain demonic elements that enabled metamorphosis. Modern historians often interpret such stories not as literal reports of hallucinations or pacts, but as artifacts of torture and cultural suggestion. Once an individual came under suspicion for supernatural crimes, the questions posed during interrogation frequently led the accused toward such answers. Whether Garnier genuinely believed he had been visited by Satan or merely repeated what inquisitors expected to hear remains unknown. What is more verifiable is the pattern of Garnier's predation. The shift from forager to killer was not immediate, but it was deliberate. The first victim was a young girl no more than 10 years old who had been sent to fetch water from a nearby stream. Garnier, according to his confession, watched her for some time before approaching. When she bent down to fill her pail, he attacked. The details of the assault as recorded in legal documents are stark. Garnier reportedly strangled the girl, dragged her into the underbrush, and tore at her with his teeth. He consumed part of her thighs and arms, then carried portions of her flesh back to his home. Apolline may have been aware of the food's origin, or she may not have asked. Importantly, Garnier made no effort to conceal the body. This suggests either a lack of understanding about criminal detection or a belief that no one would care. The body was eventually found partially eaten and decomposed, sparking alarm among the villagers. Initially, blame was placed on wolves, logical enough given the proximity to the forest and the condition of the corpse. But Garnier did not stop. Within weeks, another child was attacked under similar circumstances, and then another. These were not impulsive acts of rage. They followed a consistent method, stalking, ambushing, partial consumption, and withdrawal. The targets were always children easy to overpower and less likely to resist. Garnier's decision to focus on them was likely tactical, not symbolic. His predation was mobile. He did not kill in the same place twice. He ranged across the forest and into nearby settlements, selecting victims who were alone. In some cases, he allegedly used familiarity to lure them, claiming to be a friend of the family or offering small gifts. Such tactics implied not madness, but calculation. And yet Garnier's own accounts do not support the notion of cool rationality. In his confession, he spoke of hunger, compulsion, and torment. He said he could not stop himself. Whether this was an attempt to elicit mercy or a reflection of genuine psychological disturbance is impossible to determine. What is clear is that he was becoming less cautious. He returned to familiar areas, left more obvious signs, and was eventually spotted. The psychological toll on the community cannot be understated. Families stopped sending their children on errands. Fields near the woods went untended. Some villagers carried knives or wooden crosses. Others turned to the church demanding that priests bless their homes and conduct mass exorcisms. Rumors began to circulate that the killer was not a man but a beast, one who walked upright with matted hair and glowing eyes. These rumors dovetailed seamlessly with the local folklore of the loup-garou. For centuries, French villagers had passed down tales of men who became wolves during times of famine or sin. These were not purely fictional stories, but reflections of cultural anxieties about outsiders, about uncontrolled appetites, and about divine punishment. By late autumn, Gilles Garnier had earned a new name in village circles, the Werewolf of Dole. Whether he had heard the term himself is unclear, but his actions were becoming more reckless and the villagers more determined. The stage was now set for confrontation. Garnier had moved from the margins of society to the center of its fear. His solitary life, once merely strange, had become emblematic of evil. The villagers no longer saw him as a man, they saw a monster. The line between myth and man had fully collapsed. The third known killing attributed to Gilles Garnier occurred under conditions strikingly similar to the first two. A boy aged around 12 had been gathering firewood at the edge of the forest near dusk. His family reported him missing after dark, and a search party combed the area through the night. The next morning, his remains were found some distance from where he had last been seen. His torso had been torn open. Flesh from his legs and arms had been removed with what seemed like human teeth. Local authorities recorded the wounds in detail, noting that they were inconsistent with those made by wolves. Yet it was precisely this inconsistency that stoked the idea of a werewolf. As the killings escalated, so too did the fear. The people of Franche-Comté were familiar with violence between wars, robber bands, and famine. The 16th century was nothing if not brutal. But this was something different. These were not acts of vengeance or opportunistic theft. They seemed to belong to a category of crime that hovered between the human and the unnatural. The bodies were often desecrated. In one case, the skin of a girl's cheek had been peeled away. In another, entrails had been partially removed and left draped over a tree root. These grotesque details were passed along by word of mouth and further embroidered with each telling. Villagers began to report strange sightings in the woods. A man-shaped figure crouched in the underbrush. A howl that sounded almost human. Some claimed to have seen glowing eyes. Though modern accounts would attribute these to fear-induced hallucinations, they were taken seriously at the time. In the absence of scientific explanation, sensory perception was considered valid evidence. If someone claimed to have seen a man change into a beast, the courts might accept that testimony as fact. It was at this point that an organized response emerged. The local magistrate in Dole, prompted by petitions from frightened villagers, authorized the creation of werewolf patrols. These were bands of armed men assigned to guard roads, watch forest edges, and investigate any suspicious activity. Rewards were promised to anyone who could capture or kill the creature responsible. The patrols did not work under modern notions of law enforcement. They were closer to malicious rough justice rendered by frightened neighbors. The patrols served a dual-purpose physical protection and psychological reassurance. Seeing men with torches and pikes combing the woods gave villagers a sense of action, but it also risked inflaming tensions. Outsiders, vagrants, and anyone living on the margins quickly became suspect. Garnier, by virtue of his solitary lifestyle, became a natural target. And yet for several weeks he avoided capture. He continued to hunt it. A girl no older than 9 was taken from the road between Dole and Saint-Bonneau. This time her older brother, who had been walking a short distance ahead, reported seeing a man emerge from behind a thicket and drag her off the path. Though terrified, the boy ran to the nearest farm and raised the alarm. Several villagers returned to the area and managed to follow a trail of blood. They arrived too late to save the girl, but not too late to glimpse her killer. At first, the group thought they were dealing with a wild animal, but as they approached, they saw a man hunched over the body, tearing flesh with his hands and mouth. Shouts rang out. The figure looked up, then bolted into the trees. One of the men, a shepherd, recognized him by the shaggy hair, the hunched posture, and the way he limped as he ran. He was certain it was Gilles Garnier. This eyewitness account changed the tone of the investigation. Until now, Garnier had been a peripheral figure, odd perhaps, but not formally accused. Now he was seen as the embodiment of the evil that had terrorized the countryside. A man seen feasting on human flesh. That detail, though difficult to process, was consistent with all the legends and fears of the time. A human predator empowered by the devil, consumed by appetite. The news spread quickly. Within days, a formal complaint was issued. A warrant was drawn up. Garnier's hermitage was searched. According to the trial record, scraps of clothing were found too small for Garnier or his wife to have worn. Bones, possibly human, were unearthed from a shallow pit nearby. Whether these items were planted mice-identified or accurately linked to the murders remains uncertain. For the villagers and for the local authorities, the case was all but solved. Garnier was apprehended in late November 1572. The exact circumstances of his arrest are vague, but he did not resist. He was brought to Dole and confined to a small cell beneath the town's judicial hall. Over the next several days, he would be subjected to interrogation and eventually to torture. The villagers, for their part, reacted with a mixture of relief and revulsion. Public opinion settled quickly into a familiar narrative. Garnier was not simply a killer, but a loup-garou. He had made a pact with Satan. He had chosen to feed on children rather than starve. He had become something less than human. What made the story so powerful, so terrifying, was not only the brutality of the acts, but the banality of the man. Garnier was not some supernatural creature. He was known. He had lived among them. They had seen him at the market. He had married. He had at some point been just another villager. His fall into monstrosity suggested a disturbing possibility that evil could grow from within, not merely arrive from beyond. The case also reinforced a set of existing beliefs. The church had long warned that sin led to moral and physical decay. The body, if not governed by the soul, could be overtaken by animal instincts. Garnier, in this framework, was not an aberration, but a warning. He was what happened when man surrendered to base appetite and demonic influence. His transformation into a predator was both literal and symbolic. For the community, then, his capture was not just the end of a crime wave, it was a reaffirmation of moral order. The world thrown into chaos by a series of inexplicable murders had been restored. The monster had a name. He could be punished. Justice would be served. But that justice would not be swift. Before Garnier could be executed, he would have to confess. And before he would confess, he would have to endure. Gilles Garnier's interrogation began almost immediately after his capture. He was held in the town of Dole under the authority of the Parlement of Franche-Comté, a regional judicial body that operated with considerable autonomy. By late 1572, the court had already handled multiple cases involving witchcraft, sorcery, and lycanthropy. Garnier's case would fit neatly into that established legal framework. In this period, confessions were considered the gold standard of evidence, especially in cases involving supernatural crimes. Testimonies from witnesses and physical evidence had limited weight unless they were corroborated by a direct admission of guilt. Garnier's denial, therefore, was not an option. He would be made to confess. The only question was how quickly he would do so and under what conditions. Trial records, which were preserved and later published by French antiquarians in the 19th century, describe the proceedings in sparse but chilling detail. Garnier was accused not merely of murder, but of inhuman acts of savagery against children aided by the devil. The charges included mutilation, cannibalism, and heresy, each a capital offense on its own. Together they pointed to not only a crime against the body, but a crime against the soul. Under questioning, Garnier initially denied wrongdoing. He claimed that he was simply a poor man who hunted small animals and foraged for food. But as the days passed and the pressure increased, his responses changed. Whether out of fear, confusion, or the physical toll of his confinement, he began to yield. The court appointed a confessor, a cleric tasked with extracting a religious admission of guilt. In such trials, legal and spiritual judgment were tightly intertwined. The presence of the church was essential in confirming that the crime stemmed from diabolical influence. Garnier's soul had to be purged through admission before his body could be punished through execution. As expected, torture was applied. Though the records do not describe the exact methods, the period's standard techniques included the strappado, suspending the victim by the arms, often dislocating the shoulders, sleep deprivation, and prolonged starvation. Garnier's body, already weakened by malnourishment and his primitive lifestyle, could not have endured much. After several sessions, he confessed. His statement followed the contours of what interrogators likely wanted to hear. He claimed that while hunting in the forest, he had encountered a black man who offered him an ointment that would transform him into a wolf. In exchange, he would be allowed to feed on human flesh, specifically children. Garnier admitted to accepting the deal, applying the ointment, and stalking his victims in lupine form. The imagery of transformation was consistent with contemporary folklore. Garnier said he could feel his limbs stretch and his body contort. He claimed that his senses grew sharper, that he was driven by insatiable hunger. When he encountered children alone in the woods, he could not help himself. He gave in to the beast within. The description, half religious allegory, half physiological horror, satisfied the court's expectations. Whether Garnier truly believed in his own transformation is impossible to determine. Historians have debated this point extensively. Some suggest that his mental health had deteriorated to the point of delusion. Others argue that the confession was shaped entirely by torture, cultural suggestion, and leading questions. In either case, the court accepted his statement as valid. The most disturbing part of the confession came when Garnier recounted specific details of his crimes. He named the victims at least 4, describing how he approached them, subdued them, and consumed their flesh. In one instance, he said he strangled a boy, then used a sharpened stick to remove meat from the thighs and buttocks. He claimed to have brought the flesh home to his wife, who cooked it without question. Apolline, when interrogated, denied any knowledge of her husband's crimes. She claimed that he often brought home meat, but she assumed it was wild game. The court appears to have accepted her defense. She was not charged, likely due to a lack of evidence and the need to isolate Garnier as the sole source of evil in the narrative. Public interest in the trial was intense. Word spread quickly throughout the surrounding villages. Spectators gathered outside the courthouse. Pamphlets were printed in nearby cities recounting the events in lurid detail. The image of the cannibal hermit who roamed the woods as a wolf captivated the public imagination. It also reinforced the necessity of strong moral order. If a man like Garnier could exist, if he could walk among others undetected, then the church and the courts had to act with uncompromising severity. The trial lasted several days. At its conclusion, Garnier was declared guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by burning, customary for crimes involving heresy or sorcery. Execution by fire was considered a spiritual punishment as much as a physical one. The flames were meant to purify the soul to prevent the devil from reclaiming the condemned in the afterlife. Garnier's final days in prison are scarcely recorded. He was likely held in a damp cell, shackled and malnourished, awaiting the date of execution. Some accounts suggest that he expressed remorse. Others state that he lapsed into silence. No priest recorded a formal confession of repentance. In the eyes of the court, this made the public spectacle of his execution all the more necessary. The trial served as a moral lesson. The confession, whether genuine or coerced, fit every expectation of a society obsessed with spiritual corruption. It illustrated the dangers of isolation, the consequences of desperation, and the ever-present threat of the devil's influence. To the people of Dole, the case of Gilles Garnier was not merely a crime story, it was evidence of the world's fragility, a reminder that the line between man and beast was perilously thin. The sentence would be carried out in full view of the community that had once ignored, then feared, and finally condemned him. They would watch as justice was served and as a man was burned for the sins of his hunger, his madness, and his myth. On the morning of January 18, 1573, the people of Dole began to gather at the town's central execution ground. The winter air was sharp and biting, and a low fog hung above the cobblestone square, muffling the sound of shuffling feet and murmured prayers. Fires had been lit early in the morning to keep the crowd warm, but their smoke mixed uneasily with the purpose of the day. A scaffold had been erected the night before its centerpiece, a heavy iron stake surrounded by timber and brush, the pyre upon which Gilles Garnier would die. Public executions in early modern France were both punitive and performative. They served not only to punish, but to reassert social order. For crimes of ordinary violence, murder, theft, desertion, punishments could be swift and practical, hanging, decapitation, even branding. But for crimes believed to involve sorcery, diabolism, or spiritual corruption, fire was the preferred sentence. Burning was a method rooted in both tradition and symbolism. It destroyed the physical body while signaling divine judgment on the condemned soul. For an accused werewolf like Garnier, it was the only fate acceptable to church and court alike. Before the execution could proceed, a final ritual was required. Garnier was brought out under guard from his prison cell, thin and visibly weakened. His clothes were little more than rags, and chains clinked softly at his ankles and wrists. According to observers, he walked with difficulty but did not resist. A priest followed closely behind, reciting psalms and urging Garnier to confess and repent. There is no evidence that he did. The spectacle was meant to be instructive. The crowd included not only townspeople, but villagers from Saint-Bonneau and nearby hamlets. Parents held their children close, pointing silently toward the man who had, by his own words, consumed the flesh of the innocent. Some spectators wept, others hurled curses. A few crossed themselves, repeatedly fearful that Garnier might die without proper repentance, thereby damning his soul and cursing the land. As was customary, the sentence was read aloud by the town bailiff. It listed Garnier's crimes in full: the murder and cannibalization of 4 children, the invocation of demonic forces, and the use of witchcraft to transform into a wolf. The legal phrasing was deliberately precise and detailed, meant to drive home the nature of the transgressions. There was no mention of mental illness or poverty. The judgment rendered him not merely guilty, but irredeemably corrupt. The executioners then fastened Garnier to the stake. His arms were bound tightly behind him, his torso secured by an iron collar. Kindling and dry brush were packed around his legs and feet. The final preparations were methodical. A delay would not only risk prolonging the spectacle unnecessarily, but also undermine its impact. Efficiency and horror had to be balanced. At the signal, a torch was brought forward and lowered to the base of the pyre. The flames caught quickly. Dry wood and brush flared upward, licking at Garnier's clothes and legs. According to contemporary accounts, he made no sound for several moments. Then, as the flames rose, he began to scream. Witnesses described his cries as animalistic howling, guttural, wordless. For a man accused of becoming a beast, it was a final echo of the very myth that had condemned him. Execution by fire was not instant. The body could take many minutes to succumb. Garnier's legs were likely the first to burn, followed by his abdomen and chest. His face, exposed to heat and smoke, blackened and peeled. Eyewitnesses often interpreted such details as signs of judgment, If the fire burned clean, it was said the soul had been accepted by God. If it was slow or erratic, the devil was believed to be dragging the soul into hell. At some point, Garnier's cries stopped. His body slumped forward as far as his restraints allowed. The fire continued to rise. The wood beneath him cracked and hissed. Eventually, what remained was a charred figure amid collapsing embers. The executioners waited until the fire had fully consumed the body before dispersing the ashen remains. This, too, was symbolic. Nothing of the werewolf should be allowed to remain. The crowd gradually dispersed. Some returned to their homes in silence. Others spoke of what they had seen with a mixture of relief and revulsion. For weeks afterward, the execution was the subject of conversation, speculation, and moral reflection. Had Garnier truly been a werewolf, or merely a madman destroyed by hunger and fear? The official record left no room for doubt. The court had pronounced him guilty, and the flames had sealed that judgment. For the authorities, the execution was a success. It reasserted their role as protectors of both civil and spiritual order. The community, once paralyzed by terror, could now return to normal life. Children allowed again to walk alone, villagers to venture into the woods without looking over their shoulders. But the story of Garnier would not vanish. Almost immediately, his case began to circulate beyond Dole. Clerics used it as a warning in sermons. Printed pamphlets recounted the tale in grisly detail, often embellishing the account with additional victims or supernatural elements. In these versions, Garnier was no longer a poor man who succumbed to desperation. He was a demon in human form, an agent of the devil who had been unmasked and destroyed by righteous fire. The spectacle of Garnier's death reinforced key social messages that deviance leads to destruction, that isolation breeds corruption, and that evil must be met with uncompromising force. These messages would find fertile ground in the decades to come as similar trials unfolded across France and the Holy Roman Empire. Garnier was not the last man to be burned for lycanthropy. He was, however, among the first whose case would enter the broader European consciousness as a cautionary tale. In the eyes of the 16th century audience, justice had been done. A monster had been killed. A community had been saved. But for modern historians, the story leaves more troubling questions. What role did poverty, superstition, and judicial coercion play in Garnier's fate? Was he a predator or a scapegoat for a society eager to simplify the causes of its suffering? These questions would not be asked for centuries. At the time, only one answer seemed to matter. Gilles Garnier had confessed he had burned, and the forest was safe again. In the months following Gilles Garnier's execution, the community of Dole returned to a tentative sense of normalcy. The disappearances stopped. Patrols were gradually withdrawn from the forests. Parents began allowing their children to walk short distances unattended once more. The collective relief was palpable, but it was built on the uneasy foundation of a trauma that had not yet been processed. While the threat had been neutralized, the deeper anxieties remained unresolved. The Garnier case had been unusual not simply for its brutality, but for the nature of its prosecution. Unlike many witchcraft trials of the period which relied heavily on hearsay or isolated accusations, this case had been constructed around a sequence of physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and ultimately a confession that aligned with widely held religious beliefs. In short, it was an ideal case for reinforcing the legitimacy of both civil and ecclesiastical authority. The Parlement of Franche-Comté preserved the records of the trial, recognizing it as a precedent. Future cases of alleged lycanthropy would cite Garnier's testimony and punishment as proof that such transformations were possible and punishable. In this way, his execution had an afterlife far beyond the ashes left in Dole's execution ground. Garnier had not only been judged, he had become a model for judging others. This legal ripple effect can be observed in similar cases that emerged in the years to follow. In 1589, Jean Grenier, another French youth, would confess to turning into a wolf and attacking children. Though his case ended differently, he was imprisoned rather than burned. It still relied on the template forged in Garnier's trial: demonic pact, supernatural transformation, and carnivorous compulsion. The mythos of the werewolf was thus not merely a cultural story, it had become a legal category. The theology behind such cases was equally codified. Church authorities emphasized that Garnier's transformation was not magical in the fairy tale sense, but spiritual and moral. The devil, in their view, corrupted not the flesh directly, but the will. Through this corruption, a man could behave like an animal, become alien to his fellow humans, and descend into evil so deep it required annihilation. Garnier's case was cited in sermons as evidence of what awaited those who strayed from faith, rejected community, and gave themselves over to base desire. Meanwhile, in the region around Dole, the oral retellings of the Garnier case took on a life of their own. Children were warned to behave lest the wolf of Saint-Bonneau return. Stories recounted a figure with glowing eyes and blackened hands who still haunted the forest paths at night, waiting for stragglers. These tales, more folklore than fact, extended the psychological legacy of Garnier far beyond his death. He became a specter of disorder, a personification of the unknown dangers lurking in the woods. The villagers' reliance on this narrative, however, also served a deeper function. It gave form to their fears. Famine, war, plague. These were impersonal threats impossible to predict or control, but Garnier was tangible. He had a face, a name, a crime. By burning him, they had symbolically conquered the chaos around them. The fact that his acts had occurred in the context of widespread hunger and political instability was largely omitted in the retelling. That omission is significant. Garnier's crimes, if his confession is taken at face value, were not those of a man acting out of ideology or even sadism. They were acts of hunger committed in the depths of social isolation and mental instability. In that sense, Garnier was as much a product of his environment as he was a perpetrator of violence. His descent into madness, if such it was, had been accelerated by poverty, marginalization, and the breakdown of communal structures. Modern historians have grappled with the implications of this. Was Garnier a psychopath? A mentally ill individual suffering from delusions shaped by religious language? Or was he a scapegoat, an unlucky man whose odd behavior and bad timing made him a convenient target for a society desperate to explain the unexplainable? The answer remains elusive, not least because the sources are filtered through the lenses of torture fear and institutional authority. What is clear is that Garnier's case illuminates a broader truth about early modern Europe, that the line between justice and ritual was often thin. Trials were not merely about determining guilt, but about restoring cosmic and social order. The execution was not just punishment, it was performance warning and catharsis. This dynamic also explains why the werewolf myth endured in legal and religious discourse long after the Enlightenment had begun challenging its premises. The idea of the werewolf embodied a deep anxiety about what happens when civilization fails, when the rules that bind people together break down. Garnier became a symbol of that breakdown, a man who stepped outside the community, and in doing so, lost his humanity. Even as skepticism about supernatural crimes increased in the 17th and 18th centuries, the symbolic power of the Garnier case lingered. It was cited in moral treatises printed in popular collections of legal curiosities and adapted in fictional retellings. Each version reshaped the story to suit the needs of the moment, sometimes emphasizing Garnier's monstrosity, other times his vulnerability. But none could fully erase the unease his case provoked. At the core of that unease is a question that remains relevant even today. What happens when a person becomes so desperate, so disconnected, that they no longer see others as human or themselves as such? For Garnier, the answer was death by fire. For the society that condemned him, the answer was a reaffirmation of its own boundaries between man and beast, sin and salvation, self and other. In burning Garnier, they had done more than end a life. They had drawn a line in the ash, a line that defined who belonged and who did not. The werewolf trials of the 16th century, and the case of Gilles Garnier in particular, occurred during a time of profound transformation in European law, religion, and society. Yet, even amid shifting structures of governance and nascent scientific inquiry, old fears retained their grip. Garnier's execution in 1573 did not mark the end of such cases. In fact, in the following decades, France would witness multiple additional trials of alleged loups garous, each echoing the same template: starvation, marginalization, suspicion, and a legal process shaped as much by theology as by evidence. In the years immediately after Garnier's death, Franche-Comté remained a region beset by instability. Habsburg rule, while nominally protective, did little to address local economic hardships or the lingering effects of the French Wars of Religion. Famine remained common, and in rural communities like Saint-Bonneau, rumors of supernatural threats continued to surface whenever disaster struck. Though no subsequent case in the area matched Garnier's notoriety, the fear of the loup-garou persisted in local folklore and ecclesiastical warnings. The records from Garnier's trial were preserved not only in regional legal archives, but also by Catholic clerics eager to document evidence of demonic activity. In their view, Garnier's confession affirmed the Church's long-standing claims about the devil's ability to seduce and transform the wicked. Priests throughout eastern France used his story as a tool for moral instruction, particularly with the youth. If a man could become a beast through sin and isolation, then the only protection was prayer obedience and communion with the Church. But not all commentators accepted the dominant narrative without question. As literacy increased and ideas from the Italian Renaissance and Protestant Reformation filtered into France, some began to express skepticism, not necessarily about Garnier's guilt, but about the reliability of confessions extracted under duress. Early humanist writers questioned whether Garnier had been mad rather than evil, or whether his belief in transformation had been implanted during his interrogation. By the early 17th century, a new trend began to emerge in European legal discourse. Judicial skepticism towards supernatural transformation gained momentum, particularly in more urbanized or cosmopolitan courts. Judges in larger cities like Paris or Lyon began to favor natural explanations over demonic ones. Cases involving werewolves were increasingly reclassified as instances of mental illness, criminal predation, or extreme social deviance. This shift, however, was far from universal. In rural regions, especially those distant from centralized authorial beliefs, lingered. The loup-garou continued to be treated not merely as a threat to the body, but as an infection of the soul. Local magistrates, often influenced by deeply held religious convictions and by community pressure, had little incentive to deviate from precedent. And the precedent, thanks in large part to the case of Gilles Garnier, had been firmly established. Even outside the courtroom, Garnier's legacy continued to evolve. His story was absorbed into a growing body of popular literature. Broadsheets, chapbooks, and later folklore collections frequently retold his deeds, sometimes amplifying them beyond recognition. In some versions, he was said to have murdered dozens of children. In others, he was portrayed as a literal wolf who wore human skin to infiltrate the village. These exaggerations reflect not historical truth, but cultural function. Garnier had become a symbol. This symbolic role carried into the Enlightenment era. Voltaire and other philosophers occasionally referenced cases like Garnier's to criticize the excesses of superstition and the dangers of unchecked religious authority. For them, his trial was not just a medieval curiosity, it was a cautionary tale about what happens when fear overrides reason and when institutions exploit that fear for control. Even so, public fascination with werewolves never entirely faded. In the 19th century, as Romanticism revived interest in folklore, and the grotesque Garnier reappeared in literature and art, Gothic novels and sensational histories invoked his name alongside witches and vampires, reimagining him, not as a legal case, but as a tragic anti-hero. In these retellings, Garnier was less a monster and more a victim of hunger madness and a world that could not understand him. This reinterpretation paralleled the rise of modern criminology and psychology. The 19th and early 20th centuries brought new attempts to explain historical cases like Garnier's through medical frameworks. Terms like clinical lycanthropy emerged to describe individuals who believed themselves to be animals. Though rare, such cases were documented and analyzed, providing a possible retrospective diagnosis for Garnier's apparent delusions. Yet even these rational frameworks could not fully dispel the myth. The archetype of the werewolf, a man consumed by his own savagery, transformed by hunger, driven to prey upon the weak, continued to resonate. It found new expression in film fiction and psychoanalysis. From silent movies to 20th century horror films, the story structure remained largely unchanged. A man isolated and tormented gives in to the beast within. In that sense, Gilles Garnier became something more than a historical figure. He became a template. His story, stripped of its regional specifics, now embodies a universal anxiety, the fragility of civilization, and the darkness that can emerge when structures fail. Whether viewed as murderer madman or myth Garnier, represents a warning encoded deep within Western storytelling about boundaries crossed, humanity lost, and the high cost of returning to the fold. That his death was recorded, ritualized, and remembered speaks to the power of narrative in shaping collective memory. The villagers who watched him burn believed they were witnessing the triumph of order over chaos. They could not have known that the story would outlive them, recast again and again in new forms, carrying with it the enduring question of what it truly means to be monstrous. Centuries after Gilles Garnier's death, the case still commands a place in legal, psychological, and folkloric discourse. But to fully understand its long shadow, one must return to its original setting, a cold, isolated hermitage in the woods of Franche-Comté, and a man whose actions, whether monstrous, delusional, or desperate, left behind a trail of bodies and a legacy of fear. In the immediate years after the execution, Garnier's name became shorthand for a certain kind of evil in rural France. For villagers with little access to formal education or written records, the story passed orally: the man who lived in the woods and devoured children, the werewolf who burned while howling like the beast he had become. These tales served a dual function: warning and entertainment, folklore and moral code. Just as medieval saints were remembered for their miracles, Garnier was remembered for his depravity. The physical site of his execution, once a place of horror and fascination, eventually faded from collective memory. The stake, the pyre, the ashes, all were erased by time. But the story persisted. Travelers, priests, and schoolmasters told variations of it to different audiences, adapting the details to the anxieties of each generation. In times of famine, Garnier was a warning against desperate hunger. In times of war, he became a metaphor for unchecked violence. And in times of plague, he was the outsider who brought ruin from the woods. Meanwhile, scholarly attention returned to Garnier's case periodically as interest in the history of witch trials grew. In the 19th century, the French historian Henri Boguet republished elements of the trial record, inserting Garnier into a broader catalogue of demonic possession and lycanthropy. Boguet's framing, though deeply religious, offered a bridge between folklore and legal history, showing how beliefs about the supernatural had direct influence on judicial proceedings. In the 20th century, with the advent of psychoanalysis and forensic psychiatry, Garnier's case was re-examined in new light. Some scholars posited that he suffered from a rare condition now known as clinical lycanthropy, a psychological disorder in which the afflicted believe they have transformed into an animal. Others suggested that Garnier's confessions were the product of intense coercion and torture, citing the religious and social climate of the time as key factors in shaping his narrative. Still others examined the trial as a function of power. To them, Garnier's execution was less about one man's crimes and more about the need for a fractured society to reassert control. Amid famine, political tension, and religious conflict, the spectacle of punishing a werewolf served as a symbolic purge. By destroying Garnier, the state and church were attempting to exorcise their own insecurities, projecting internal disorder onto an expendable figure at the edge of society. This interpretation does not negate the suffering of Garnier's victims. By all surviving accounts, children were killed and partially consumed, and the community's terror was real. But it complicates the narrative. It suggests that Garnier may have been in equal measure a predator and a product of his environment. In a world where hunger, fear, and religious dogma intersected, the line between perpetrator and scapegoat often blurred. In modern cultural memory, Gilles Garnier now straddles multiple worlds. He appears in books of true crime alongside serial killers and cannibals. He surfaces in anthologies of folklore as the Werewolf of Dole. He features in horror films and novels as a prototype for the haunted, cursed man who succumbs to animal urges. Each depiction carries echoes of the original, even when divorced from historical accuracy. Yet despite these distortions, the fundamental questions his case raises remain startlingly contemporary. What happens to a society that fails to care for its most vulnerable? What do we do with those who live outside the boundaries of convention and comfort? And most troubling of all, how do we respond when the monstrous appears not as some distant creature, but as one of our own, when the danger lies not in the forest but at the edge of the village? In this sense, Garnier's story continues to resonate because it speaks to a primal fear that civilization is fragile, that rules can fail, and that the beast within is never far from the surface. Whether he was mad evil or merely desperate, Garnier became the vessel into which all of these fears were poured. The final irony is that while Garnier was killed to restore a sense of order, his story has lived on precisely because it unsettles that order. It reminds us that darkness does not always come in the shape we expect, and that sometimes it wears a human face. The case of Gilles Garnier occupies a strange and haunting space in the annals of European history. Neither fully myth nor fully understood, it lingers at the intersection of crime, belief, and fear. His story, however distorted over time, serves as a window into the social and psychological landscape of early modern France, a world where supernatural explanations for suffering were not only common but institutionalized. To examine Garnier is to confront the mechanisms by which a community processes horror by narrating it, externalizing it, and ultimately destroying it in ritual form. What makes Garnier's legacy so enduring is not just the grisly nature of his alleged acts, but the symbolic clarity with which they were interpreted. He was transformed from a man into a beast, not just through folklore, but through the machinery of law and religion. His trial and execution reflect a society's attempt to manage chaos by labeling it, by giving it a name, a face, and a stake on which to burn. And yet the ambiguities persist. Was Garnier a serial killer driven by hunger and madness? A deluded man coerced into confession? A scapegoat sacrificed to preserve the illusion of order? The historical record cannot resolve these questions, and perhaps that is why his story continues to fascinate. In every retelling, whether as a legal precedent, a horror tale, or a psychological case study, Gilles Garnier emerges as a mirror reflecting not only the fears of his time, but those that remain with us still. He is in the end less a singular villain than a cautionary figure reminding us that when systems fail, when compassion erodes, and when fear takes hold, it becomes dangerously easy to mistake the desperate for the damned.